Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. The White House is attempting to blunt the pressures of inflation millions of Americans are currently feeling. President Biden announced the release of 50 million barrels of oil from the nation's strategic reserves, trying to counter the rising price of gas.
Disruptions related to the pandemic have caused challenges in our supply chain, which have sparked concern about shortages and contributed to higher prices. Moms and dads are worried, asking, will there be enough food we can afford to buy for the holidays? Will we be able to get Christmas presents to the kids on time? And if so, will they cost me an arm and a leg? I told you before that we're going to take action on these problems. That's exactly what we're doing.
Shortly after the president spoke, Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm reiterated the administration's concerns over Americans contending with high prices.
As the Energy Information Agency has projected, the price of gasoline will come down, what they project to be below $3 a gallon in 2022, early 2022, and continue to ratchet down bit by bit. What we want to do with today's action is to bridge the gap between the high prices today, try to reduce it as much as we can within our power by increasing the supply that we have access to, as we move through and the market then corrects itself and hopefully increases supply from the private sector.
As we reported yesterday, the House Select Committee investigating January 6th is continuing to subpoena allies of former President Trump. The latest two are Roger Stone, the recipient of a pardon from the former president after his indictment for lying to Congress, and Alex Jones, who recently lost a case brought by families of the Sandy Hook school shooting. Tuesday, the committee issued more subpoenas, including to far-right extremist groups, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. Related to the deadly riot at the Capitol on January 6th, the federal judge in Colorado has ordered two attorneys who challenged the results of the 2020 presidential election to pay $187,000 to defray the legal fees of the many parties they sued. In his ruling, the magistrate judge criticized the attorneys for, quote, prematurely repeating in court pleadings unverified and uninvestigated defamatory rumors that strike at the heart of our democratic system and were used by others to foment a violent insurrection. The size of the penalty is intended as a deterrent for others using frivolous suits to undermine the democratic system. Let's bring in Ed O'Keefe, Maya King, and Theo Meyer. Ed is a CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Maya is a political reporter for Politico, and Theo is a national political reporter for The Washington Post. Welcome to all of you. Maya, let me start with you. What did President Biden say in his speech today about how the White House is going to deal with inflation, generally speaking?
Yeah, the president really aimed to, I think, take a more conciliatory tone. He recognized the fact that Thanksgiving is a time that people are spending a lot more money for gas, for travel, and even to prepare meals for their families, and that all of those things are more expensive. And so I think he laid out as best as he could, really, what this White House's administration was doing to try to keep this from hurting families as much as possible and to keep prices as low as possible. Of course, the big news in his address was the fact that he was going to dip into reserves to make sure that gas prices would be lower, to have a direct hand in lowering gas prices. This address, of course, comes on the heels of the holiday season, but also at a time where the president's approval ratings are dipping a bit lower. And this is definitely not a time, I think, where you want to be delivering an address to the American people that says things are going to get more expensive. So this really felt very much like an address that aimed to calm the nerves of many people, understanding, of course, that given inflation and a number of other dynamics taking place, of course, with the supply chain as well, that his administration was really aiming to try to keep this from trying to blunt the impact of these rising prices.
Well, Ed, at the briefing, you asked Energy Secretary Granholm for more clarity about releasing oil from the reserves. Let's listen to some of that.
How many barrels of oil does the U.S. consume per day?
I don't have that number in front of me, sorry.
So some suggest it's about 18 million, which would suggest you're releasing less than 3 days' worth of supply from the petroleum reserve. Why is that enough?
Well, what we are doing, plus what other countries may be doing, which will be less than what we're doing because we have the largest amount of strategic petroleum reserves, we believe will be this bridge.
All right, so Ed, what is the bottom line here? Do we know if and when Americans are going to feel relief at the gas pump?
Nope, we don't. And today, the Energy Secretary not only couldn't tell us how many barrels of oil are consumed by the United States each day, but couldn't pin down when exactly the price of oil would come down, or price of gas would come down for that matter, and how long this might take. And that's understandable because the United States and the Energy Secretary don't control the price of gas. The market does. And the market over the course of today saw the price of oil go up and down and didn't necessarily give them the immediate response that they might have been anticipating. But what she was suggesting there in her answer is that this is a short-term solution and that the president may be holding out to use other quivers in his pocket, if you will, or other tools at his disposal if the price of oil and gas don't start to come down to a level where they believe it should be. But both the president and the energy secretary kind of admitting that it's going to be a little while until you see the results of this. That should be understandable to most Americans, given that they announced this today. But she couldn't tell us how long it will take for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to pump out these 50 million barrels of oil, why only essentially what it amounts to no more than 3 days' worth of oil is enough, and by when we might see some relief. But in her answer, notably, she said, it might come down to 317 in December and then into January. So I said, well, hold on. That means that we're going to see these high prices through the Christmas season? And she didn't rule that out. Is that what Americans want to hear? Probably not. But is that the market reality? Given that the United States government doesn't control the price of gas? Yeah, it might be.
Switching gears, President Biden has taken some criticism for not offering much direct access to the media. The New York Times counts around a dozen one-on-one interviews 9 months into his term, well behind Presidents Trump and Obama. Have you seen any indication that we might see more sit-downs with President Biden? We have not, and we should sort of separate these two. When it comes to seeing the president or access to him on a regular basis, sure, he is seen on a fairly regular basis by at least the press pool, or the small group of print, radio, and television reporters that go in to see him if it's here at the White House or when he's on the road traveling across the country. A formal news conference, it's been months since he had one of those. The first one that they held earlier this year in the view of the White House didn't go very well. They don't think we necessarily asked the right kinds of questions, and so there hasn't been one since. They would argue that he does take questions from reporters a few times a week, or certainly over the course of 2 weeks. That is true, but they're usually quick. They're usually amid shouting or loud helicopters, and it doesn't necessarily give the American public, the voters, a clear answer. Has there been an opportunity to talk to him at length about things like what he thinks is causing inflation, how his meeting went with the Chinese president last week, what he might do about the situation that's brewing between Russia and Ukraine, what he's going to do about voting rights, police reform, filibuster reform? No, there hasn't. Nor has he sat for an extended conversation over his two biggest legislative priorities, the bipartisan infrastructure bill or the Build Back Better plan. Might we see something like that? Perhaps. And there was a hint today from the White House press secretary that there may be more conversation in the coming weeks to try to compare and contrast what this White House is trying to do about the economy versus what Republicans are proposing to do about rising prices. They say you can expect to hear more conversation from the president about that. I think this reporter, and you would say, Elaine, that we welcome the president anytime to have that conversation with CBS. 100%. All right, Ed O'Keefe, I know you have to get going. Ed, thanks so much. Let's continue our conversation. Theo, I want to ask about something that I know you wrote about in the early 202, the Washington Post early morning newsletter. What kind of headwinds is Jerome Powell facing in securing a second term as Federal Reserve Chair?
Well, I think there's overwhelming support among senators of both parties for Jerome Powell, whom President Biden re-nominated to lead the Federal Reserve yesterday. Senators from Mitt Romney to Mark Warner, senators in both parties, came out in support of him. But there had been some dissension from both environmental groups as well as a small handful of Democratic senators, including Elizabeth Warren, Sheldon Whitehouse, Jeff Merkley of Oregon, who have criticized Powell for not taking climate change sufficiently seriously, not using the power of the Fed to combat climate change in the way that President Biden has directed so many other government agencies to begin trying to do. There has also been some limited criticism of Powell for his role in a stock trading scandal that is currently roiling the Fed, involving two Fed regional bank presidents who have since retired their stock trading early in the pandemic. Which Congress could be looking into in the coming weeks and months.
All right, and Maya, let me turn to you, and I want to ask about something that your colleague, Mark Caputo, wrote about, and that is former President Trump. A group affiliated with him did polls in states that President Biden flipped from Trump in 2020. What is it that they found?
Well, essentially, what these numbers reveal is that the former President Trump is in a pretty strong position right now in a lot of those battleground states, particularly Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, and that he's ahead in these preliminary polls of President Biden by about less than 10 points in all of these states, but still enough to get those around 70 electoral votes in those battleground states that would deliver him the White House yet again in 2024. Of course, a lot has to happen. Things really have to fall into place for former President Trump, though we know that has tended to happen quite a bit in his political history. Though really what a lot of folks in his orbit are saying is that they're feeling very confident looking at these preliminary polls. Should note that the pollster who conducted this ahead of the 2020 election had some pretty bleak outlooks for the former president, essentially saying that he wasn't in a great position to secure re-election. And then, of course, that didn't happen. And so for this particular pollster, to crunch these numbers and find, at least ahead of the midterms and a full presidential campaign, that the former president is in a strong position, of course, gives him and those in his orbit reason to feel really good heading into these next two cycles.
Well, Theo, the House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol continues with subpoenas on a fairly regular basis. Today, it's leaders of the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, among others. What is the committee seeing in terms of cooperation?
Yes, as you mentioned, the committee issued several new subpoenas today, including to the leaders of several right-wing groups: the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, First Amendment, Praetorian. When it comes to these subpoenas, the committee has issued dozens of them. One of the open questions is, how it will be able to enforce the subpoenas of people who have refused to cooperate, such as Steve Bannon. You can, of course, hold people in contempt of Congress, and there are other ways of trying to induce them to cooperate. But depending on how widespread, people not cooperating is, it could be difficult for Congress, according to, some congressional investigations lawyers we've spoken with. It could be difficult for Congress to hold them all in contempt. This is a laborious and time-consuming process. So it's an open question, how many people will ultimately try to defy these subpoenas.
And finally, Maya, on the pandemic, the Biden administration faced resistance from the courts and states with its efforts to mandate COVID vaccines for all large companies. So where do things stand now?
Well, it seems to be more of a standoff now between large companies and this administration. The Biden White House, of course, has maintained their preference for folks to get vaccinated, especially heading into these colder months, understanding that this country could very well be on the heels of yet another wave of increases in viruses and virus cases and ultimately virus deaths. And so I think that's really the message now coming from the White House on this. Not necessarily that they want to be directly at odds with corporations. So this is, of course, a bit of a blow to their plans to mandate the vaccine. However, I think really what they're trying to drive home is that this is something that's a matter of public health and really public safety. Again, heading into this holiday season where more people will be gathering, more people will be indoors, and you also have the added threat of flu season on top of the COVID virus.
All right, Maya King and Theo Meyer, thank you both very much.